The Small People by Thomas Ligotti. Coming of age in this world has always been a strange process. I'm sure you understand, Doctor. There are so many adjustments that need to be made before we are presentable in company. We don't understand all the workings, all the stages of development, and the process of becoming who we are and what we are. It can be so difficult. Others expected me to be complete at a certain age, ready to jump up and take my place when called to do so. Time to wake up, they said. Time to do this or time to do that, they said. It's show time, they said. And I had better be willing and able when the time came. Please excuse my outburst, Doctor. I'm doing my best. I know my lines. I've told this story before, as you know. I do want to be good this time. My parents were always scolding me to be good about one thing or another. You came from a good family, they frequently said to me, as if saying I was biologically their own would make it so. Now, I cannot claim that their criticism of certain attitudes I held was unmerited. My mother and father resorted to using the words shameful little bigot quite a bit. How could we have raised such a shameful little bigot, she would say to him, or he would say it to her. He doesn't get it from my side of the family, one of them would shout. And then the other, right on cue, would respond, well, he doesn't get it from mine either. There it was again. The genetic issue, which might have upset me had I been older and wise to the fact that my status in the family was but a legal fiction. In light of later events, of course, biology was the least of our differences. This is a very delicate topic for me, as you know. Moving on, my parents would then fight, if only for the sake of appearances, speaking the same lines they'd spoken before. Back and forth they'd go at each other. Then finally they'd come back around to their little boy, who was such a shameful little bigot. Obviously, it wasn't in their interest to acknowledge the truth, that foremost I was afraid, not bigoted. Calling me bigoted was simply a tactic for confusing the issue. Any hatred I displayed was epiphenomenal to my fear. Every child has fears, and the worst of mine was a fear of them. Not my mother and father. Well, I was afraid of them, too. That's not unusual. But as a child, I didn't hate them. I hated those others. The small people. One time, my parents and I were on vacation. My father was at the wheel. He was smiling slightly and staring with concentration. That was how he always looked, even when he wasn't driving, always smiling slightly and always staring with concentration. Next to him, my mother sat quietly. The sun was shining on her smooth face. She had such a smooth face, Doctor, and big eyes. I was sitting in the middle of the back seat, minding my own business and taking in the wide spaces of the scenery, not focusing on anything in particular. Then I saw the sign, just off the right side of the road. It had one of those simple faces on it, and written below were the words, Small Country. My whole body tightened, as it always did when I saw one of those road signs. The arrow at the bottom of the sign pointed straight up, so that drivers would know they were in range of small country. I slid over to the right side of the car and began to survey the landscape. A short distance from the road we were on was another road, a smaller road. It meandered through an open plain slightly below us. I shifted my eyes toward the front seat and saw my father looking in the rearview mirror at me, but I didn't care. This was the closest I had ever been to small country, and I wanted to see all I could, which for a long while wasn't anything except that empty plain with that small road passing through it. Such is the perversity born of fear. At the same time that I wanted to see something, I was terrified of what I might see. I felt as if I were having one of those dreams where you're alone, but still feel the presence of something unimaginably awful that might appear all of a sudden. It was at the height of this nightmarish sensation that I saw the little car turning a bend in the small road. About the same time, our road, the big road, started curving toward the other. The closer the little car came to us, the more I felt the urge to dive to the floor of our car. But then I would have missed seeing them. Their car, the little car looked like a toy. It wasn't exactly its size that demoted it from a properly motorized conveyance to a plaything, because the pretend car wasn't so near a real car that I could compare the two. It was the flagrant actuality that everything about it was toy-like, as if it were made of molded plastic and rolling along on teetering wheels, and it bore none of the details on it of a real car, at least that I could tell. Structurally, it had a simple square body painted bright red. That had to be the color, of course, just so that it would stand out in the scene, and I could be all the more afraid than if its color had been white or yellow or some shade of blue. But I stopped attending on the car once I saw what was inside. Until then, I scarcely had a glimpse of any small people. My strange fear of them originated mostly from the simple face on the road signs that alerted people, real people, of their impending entry into small country. The mere idea of the smalls was enough to make me anxious about something I couldn't name. And after looking into that red plastic toy, I was sorry I hadn't thrown myself down onto the floor of our car, even knowing that my parents would have called me a shameful little bigot for the rest of the vacation. After our cars passed each other, my father looked in the rearview mirror and said to me, "So, do you see them?" I didn't say anything. I was defiantly silent. "Your father asked you a question," said my mother. "You should answer him." But I maintained my silence, and if I had spoken, I wouldn't have said anything about what I saw in that car. I wasn't even afraid at that point. I was bitter and resentful that my father could have asked me in such a bland tone of voice if I saw them. I wanted to scream at both my parents, scream murderously, and also with some puzzlement, a plea for understanding. How could people, big people, have such a complacent attitude towards the smalls? How could they give certain presents to children for their birthday or any time presents were in order? And those presents might look like that little car and the small people inside it. They're travesties of real people. That's all they were. Two older small people, like a father and mother, in the front seats, and two young small people, whose gender I couldn't tell at a distance, sitting rigidly in the back. How could there even exist certain toys? For instance, an imitation baking oven, a play version of the real thing, yet one that quite probably replicated the actual baking ovens used by the small people. Even if the resemblance wasn't one-to-one between the two miniature ovens, the thought could still enter a child's head. This oven must be something like those the small people have in their kitchens. Who could be so stupid or malicious that they could ignore the possibility of such a thing, that an object some children might have in front of them, or even in their little hands, could have a counterpart in small country? It was too monstrous to contemplate that at a certain age children can and do become cognizant of the likeness of their toys to entities in the small country world, including the small people who live there, if they're even alive. Why didn't they react, as I had, with fear and hatred, once they came of a certain age? Naturally, I knew that for practical reasons the world of the smalls and the real world were securely set apart, just as borders between places of divergent laws and customs were partitioned and even guarded with powerful weapons against each other. But it wasn't the same between the smalls and everyone else. This was something I felt deep inside me, though I risked being stigmatized as a shameful little bigot, not only by my parents, but by most anyone, wherever I went. For the rest of our vacation that year, I was miserably anxious, as well as miserably hateful. From the moment my father asked me if I saw what was in that little toy car, my hatred for the small people that grew out of my fear of them reached its zenith and held there. Of course I had seen them, idiot father of mine. Why did he ridicule me, taking their side? At one point, all of the occupants of the little car suddenly swiveled their heads toward us, then abruptly swiveled them back to their previously fixed positions. To my mind, they did this as if to say, "We know you are looking at us. Now we are looking at you. Now you know that we knew you were looking at us, and henceforth there will be no escaping this mutual knowledge." Those damn swivel heads, I thought, even though I can only imagine what went on in their heads, because in fact they appeared to have nothing going on inside of them. They were just hollow, empty things. Not long after this encounter, my father pointed out the window. By the side of the road was another sign with one of those simple faces on it. Below that face were the words, leaving small country. All clear, my father said with a vexing condescension in his voice and a slight smile on his face. Oh, leave the boy alone, my mother said, but only as a sort of warning that my father was taking things too far. Right then, I could have thrown a fit, the likes of which my parents had never seen or suspected of me. Nor was it wholly improbable that I might have leapt into the front seat and steered our car into the roadside ditch, which was of some depth. I might have killed us all, and perhaps only my father and mother. But then, in a flash of mentation, it occurred to me that with the demise of my parents, I would likely fall into the care of another couple whose attitude toward my fear and hatred of the small people probably would not have differed from theirs. Certainly, my disposition was not in line with that of the larger share of humanity. In good faith, I have to admit as much, Doctor. I know you must be aware of the torment an individual suffers when he begins to wonder if he is the one on the wrong side of reality. Perhaps it was a defensive tactic of my mind, then, that though I was still afflicted by fright and hatred when it came to the small people, I also felt, for the first time, a curiosity about them. Surely that signaled a healthier perspective, and I welcomed it. My newfound curiosity waxed and waned for about a year or so. It either intensified or abated, depending on how often I awoke sweating with sick horror after dreaming about the small people. I finally acted on my curiosity only after I had a dream in which real people, including myself, were somehow changed either into small people or half small people. The latter particularly disturbed me. Yes, I thought, now is the time. And so I began my quest to get to the bottom of the mystery that, at least for me, surrounded the small people. The library seemed the natural starting point to research my subject. In no time at all, it seemed I could find out all I needed to know about the small people. And possibly what I learned would terminate, or at least temper, my fear of them, and even alleviate or dissolve entirely my hatred of their kind. But I was only a child with a rudimentary conception of how things truly were in this world at its deepest level. I found out soon enough, though, that I had misled myself. I was ahead of my class in school and knew my way around a library better than most children my age. Thus, you can imagine my devastation when I failed to unearth any substantive information about the small people. How could there be such a gap in what would seem a vital realm of study? What conspiracy of silence, what code of secrecy was in effect that I could find hardly a mention of these creatures, not even in the form of records or statistics relating to them? Yet ultimately I was forced to conclude that nothing was being hidden from me or the rest of the world on the subject I attempted to investigate. At least it wasn't being hidden deliberately, consciously. That would have been an impossible task. Some blabbermouth is always around, who is unable to keep what he knows to himself. Chatterboxes, without whom the details of humanity's most lurid episodes would be lost, let alone something as conspicuous as the small people. No, Doctor. Only one thing could keep them out of the limelight. Pure neglect, a protective disinterest. As the old philosophers of the human psyche might have seen it, the mind's looking away when unsettling facts come into view, facts that one would rather not focus on for long. Where the small people were concerned, there was nearly a blackout of intelligence. I'm not saying that no one has ever ruminated on the phenomenon of the small people. No doubt everyone has pondered their existence at some time or another, but such considerations have never been sustained long enough to create a body of inquiry and knowledge. Before a pen could be put to paper or an expedition launched, some negating incuriosity set in that dissipated any spur to action, or any action that resulted in authoritative books and peer-reviewed essays in specialized journals. All that might comprise a modest shelf even in the middling libraries of our world. If you should say that even highly arcane matters, not to mention anything right before our eyes, have evaded the closest research, I would have to respond, perhaps a bit vigorously, false. Question. How could we know we were keeping certain truths from ourselves regarding how things truly were in this world at its deepest level? Answer. Because we have done it before. Do I really need to give particulars? And many continue the charade long after some voice indicates beyond credible doubt what is true and what is not. The time has not come yet, I thought, and perhaps it never would. In point of fact, though, I must admit to having heard vague mutterings about the small people when I was at the library that day. For instance, I came across a history book, that is, a book concerned with our history, and in its index there was a reference to a footnote in which the author alluded to the small people. In that footnote were written the words, "Of course they have no recorded history of their own." Naturally, this scrupulous scholar adduced his source for this assertion in the usual style, and it made me so happy to read the arid citation, C. Paulson, or maybe it was Hayworth, or possibly Haywood. Whomever I was told to see, I sought out, but nothing was contained there, nothing to corroborate that the small people had no recorded history of their own. Why would a scholar of any standing slip up that way, leading the reader to a source that does not support what he had written? Mistakes do happen, no doubt about that. But how could it be that they happened whenever someone wrote something about the small people, as I discovered they always did? All day long, one book led me to another, and each left me empty-handed. Was I being diverted here and there by falsehoods, or were bits of truth being parceled out in such a way that no complete picture formed of the small people, or none that could be placed beside the one we had of ourselves in the great photo album of humankind, a portrait that itself began to seem incomplete to a child who believed until then we knew everything that had everything to do with our world. The big world, that is. During the hours I spent that day in the library, I went from basement to belfry, only to find myself cornered by the walls of one dead end after another. With studious intent, I walked into a repository of learning with the light of a beautiful morning shining upon me and my self-appointed mission. But great clouds rolled in. Thunder shook the walls. Rain tapped louder and louder against the windows, and lightning flashed outside them. By degrees, the neat hallways of the library I had entered turned to dank and dripping stonework corridors of a Gothic castle through which I wandered in search of a way out. I trembled, as if trapped in one of those dreams of mine where I feel surrounded by unseen horrors. At last, all I wanted was to wake up. But I couldn't awake. Not until I had some answers. Abandoning the library in disgust, I returned home and moped about for weeks in a stupor of desperation and nervous suspicion. Not long after that inauspicious day of wasted labor, something happened that helped me come back to myself, such as I was, while also advancing my obsession with the swivel heads. Until then, I was no expert at making friends. How unexpected it was, then, that I should make a friend when I needed one most. I was so surprised because nothing in my life had ever worked out that way. For once, I actually gained an advantage over my circumstances. It was after school, after the time between leaving home to go to school in the mornings and leaving school in the afternoon to go back home, where I waited for it to be time for dinner, time for doing homework, and then other times until it was time to go to bed, before it was time to wake up again and face another round of times to do things. In any case, on the day in question, I made friends with this other boy. The reason for this fortuitous bond was that he spoke the following words: "Damn those small people." I asked him why he said that. I also asked if he was afraid of the small people, as I was afraid of them. He said he wasn't afraid of the small people, but I didn't believe him because of the way he said this. His eyes looked away from me, and he started to fidget. His voice became very quiet, too, until he stopped talking altogether and just stared at the ground. Then he looked up at me, shaking off the fear that possessed him, and said in a boisterous voice, "I'm not afraid of those dummy things. I just hate them." I smiled and said, "I call them swivel heads, and I hate them too." Immediately, we became friends and began spending time together every day after school. That is, until it was time for us to go home for dinner, and then go through all the other times there were. We played games the way young people do, or are supposed to do at that stage of development. We wrestled quite a bit, but there wasn't anything mean or crazy about it. We also talked a lot about the small people. One theme of conversation to which we often returned involved catching one of the smalls, and what we'd do to them if we did. I'd twist its arms, so they were backwards. To me, that seemed like something you could actually do to the small people, even if my only basis for this conviction was a brief sighting of them while on vacation a few years before. Then it would have to do everything turned around, like eating with its back to the dinner table. If they even eat. It would have to reach for its food, not being able to see it, my friend speculated, warming to his vision. I pictured the scene for a moment. I said. We laughed quite a bit about small people, whose arms and also legs we had twisted backwards, as well as other things we would do if we caught one of them. Eventually, we became so exhausted from laughing that we were out of breath and had to sit quietly for a while. That was when my friend smiled at me in a certain way, not smiling slightly like my father did, but smiling as if he was thinking something very particular, looking at me with a questioning expression on his face. And right then I had the feeling I could read his mind, and he could read mine. From that moment, we became more serious in our talks about the swivel-headed dummy things. My friend also shared with me a secret. What he told me was that his father, maybe his mother too, also hated the small people. My grandfather hated them even more. He thought all sorts of things about them, what he called their powers. Then my friend confided that his father always knew the location of small country, and their family moved every so often to avoid it. We're gonna be moving again pretty soon. Dad says that the smalls are too close already. I'm getting too closer every day. He even let me know where new small country is going up, so I won't get too near it. Not long after that day, I asked my parents if I could sleep over at my friend's house. He did the same, asking his parents if he could sleep over at my house. Our ruse worked, and on the night we were supposed to sleep over at each other's houses, we instead met at a prearranged location, the lavatory hut in the old park on the edge of town. When I entered the small wooden building, my friend was already studying a wrinkled piece of notebook paper on which he had drawn a map. Here's where the small country is going to be, he said, pointing to a place a few miles outside the town's limits. It's secluded right now, my dad said. According to my friend, however, it wouldn't be long before the signs were put up and everyone would know it was there. Not that they could do anything about it, my friend said. Yeah, I replied, knowing that whoever complained would be called a shameful bigot or some roughly equivalent term of reproach. As my friend and I sat cross-legged on the floor of the lavatory hut, it became increasingly apparent that neither of us was entirely dedicated to our plan of stealing our way into the presently secluded region of small country and capturing one of its residents. And the longer we waited, the more our project deteriorated into something ill-conceived and probably unfeasible. Ultimately, though, our doubts were overcome by our hatred. The small people, my friend said. That was all. Just 3 words, spoken in a tense, quiet voice. Yet those words gave vent to a rage at something that had seized his life. I looked at him and saw all second thoughts written on his face transform into a spirit of determination. No doubt he saw my own features, overtaken by the same spirit. We entered the secluded small country by way of a little road that was in the process of construction. Some small children were loitering in the area. Construction sites are always a temptation for children, though these small children weren't behaving in the usually rambunctious manner one might expect if they had been real children. They didn't see us, or so we assumed. But it wasn't long before they started to walk away from the hidden spot where my friend and I were observing them. It was probably time for them to be somewhere, I thought, time to do whatever the Smalls did at that hour, for by then it was almost full evening. They moved with rigid, mechanical motions, and we shadowed them easily. We could have cut up to them and grabbed one, pulled it back over into big country, normal country, I mean, the real world, where real people live. But I don't think I could have brought myself to do that, as much as my friend and I had talked about it. I looked at him, and he shook his head, so I knew he felt the same. At that point, I'm not sure that either of us knew what we wanted to do. Again, our plans were coming apart. We kept following the Smalls, though. I noticed that even if they weren't moving very fast, they did seem to be moving as fast as they could, as if they were hurrying to get somewhere. Their arms and legs shifted around in the manner of prosthetic limbs, making them look almost crippled. They're not crippled so that you felt sorry for them, I should say, but maimed in a way that made you want to keep your distance, as if they could infect you with some dreadful condition. Eventually, we saw lights ahead. With an artificial radiance, they flooded the darkness on the other side of a hill that the small children were approaching. And when they got to the top of the hill, they paused for a moment, their silhouettes outlined against the sky by the lights shining on them from below. For a moment, it was a rather picturesque tableau, but soon the small children did something with their heads, raising them up with a slow mechanical motion by elongating their necks, like a telescope sliding open a little. Then they swiveled those heads around without moving their bodies, turning them just enough so that it seemed they were looking at me and my friend. Both of us dropped to the ground as if we had been shot. In the darkness, I heard my friend whisper, "Those rotten, horrible smalls, you can never know what they're going to do. I hate them so much." "Yeah," I murmured in soft response. When we looked up from the ground, the small children were gone, no doubt having moved down the other side of the hill. It couldn't have been a very steep incline there, or so I calculated. Otherwise, the smalls, with their awkward, practically disabled bodies, wouldn't have been able to negotiate the descent. But when my friend and I ran up to the hilltop, moving in a crouched position, we saw that it was almost a straight drop over the edge. And the small children were now walking like broken robots down below us. Their destination looked like a little toy town that was evidently under construction. "See," my friend said. "My dad knew it. Pretty soon all this land around here will be small country." They were moving around like mad in a kind of pit. Stretching out for about a mile was a half-built town that was almost a double of the town where my friend and I live. The smalls were hopping around in a frenzy to finish it, as if they were on a tight schedule. "Maybe they have to complete the place before a certain time," my friend conjectured. "I also have to be working at night." Or maybe that's just the way they are, I thought. All kinds of small building machinery were positioned along the town's main street, although none of it was in motion. Small people, who looked as if they had been directing operations, stood with their stubby arms outstretched, pointing in all directions, inspecting unrolled building plans, held tightly by their tiny digits. Everyone seemed busy with some project, putting up storefronts that had little detail, or identifying features, working on skeletal frameworks that maybe were going to be houses, or carrying around what appeared to be prefabricated parts that would ultimately be integrated into the toy town. On several street corners, small people were yelling through staticky bullhorns, but they didn't seem to be addressing anyone in particular, and what they were shouting wasn't distinguishable as anything but gibberish. As a matter of fact, just pure natural fact, when I considered the scene before me from its smallest to its most prominent features, the whole enterprise of the small people's town building seemed to be nothing but an act. They weren't building anything with point and purpose at its core. Anything that was more than a spectral illusion, they were putting on a show. Whether or not this was intentional on their part intrigued me for some reason. Once I had thrown off the strangeness of the spectacle, I could see how rickety, how shoddy everything was. All the buildings were crooked or unevenly sized with respect to the town as a whole. The windows were more trapezoidal than square or rectangular, and the shutters attached to some windows hung loosely, flapping against the walls behind them. A light breeze could have caused the town to collapse and blow away, which may have accounted for the disappearance and emergence of so much small country within real landscapes. I knew that all towns, and even cities in the big world, would eventually go to ruin in time, however sturdy they might appear for however long a period. Thousands of years of towns and cities in the past had proven that. And thousands or millions of years awaited the dissolution of the world as it now stood. But this town was not made to last. It was as if the small people knew there was no point in bothering with permanence. As I said, that explained a lot to me about small country. How it was always moving from one location to another, as my friend's father was aware, so that he could move his family away from wherever it rose up after a period of seclusion. But there was also something more. They sought no permanent standing in the world. For them, existence was all chaos, nonsense, and emptiness. I knew the same thing had been written about our world, the supposedly real world, but there was opinion, speculation. Only very few had claimed as much, yet the small people as a lot seemed to embrace these objectionable qualities as truths. Now it became more explicable to me that they should be passed over in the archives of human thought. Theirs was not a lone voice, speaking out of time. Theirs was a society subsisting, even thriving, on the brink of non-existence. An enigma that repulsed wholesome deliberation by real people. And their habitats were all but ruins upon inauguration. No one in the big world, or very few, mentioned that the fully extinct leavings of towns like this remained after the Smalls relocated, because once a place had become small country, it was left alone, as if it was not fit to be reclaimed by real humans, as if the earth in these places had been polluted by an alien occupancy, and only pestilence abided there. You know this as well as I do, Doctor, but nobody writes about this fact, and its corollary that one day there will be no room left for a real world to be built. The unreal was moving in. I believe I realized this truth at a deep level within me during the one brave day I spent at a middling library, and now I was shaken by it to the marrow. Maybe there are grubby pamphlets passed around among people like my friend's father, crumpled pages whose possession would cause someone to be branded as a shameful little bigot, you might say, an outcast. So anything that appears in print or otherwise about the small people is labeled as pernicious ravings and propaganda. There are means for hushing up what people would prefer not to delve into. But I've already gone into that. Gazing at the new small town going up, such as it was to witness the intrusion of an unnatural colony of beings into the anatomy of our world. Not a different race or group, but something that did not belong, neither here nor anywhere conceivable by human senses or cognition. It was something unknown that had taken form, or was in the process of taking form, coming of age in a world it was displacing. That night, with my friend, brought so many things home to me. A new phrase in my sentiment toward the Smalls had begun fermenting within my being. "None of it is real," my friend said. "I don't know what it is." A creeping sense of something hitherto concealed overcame me, as I'm sure it did him. Fear had now gotten the better of both hatred and curiosity. Beside me, my friend whispered, "Let's get out of here." In sync, we jumped to our feet. When we turned about, though, I almost lost consciousness, for behind us was a regiment of small people standing in a semicircle. How long had they been there? To me, that was more frightening than discovering their presence, being watched without knowing it by a group of Smalls. They didn't speak a word, neither to us nor among one another. Nothing shocked me about that, but it did add to the disorienting unreality of the situation. For a time they stayed in place. Paradoxically, they appeared gigantic, that is, gigantic for toys, given their toy-like aspect. For instance, their clothes seemed to be painted on them, not worn by them, and their faces were so smooth, gleaming in the moonlight without any of the characteristic qualities of flesh. Despite their masculine semblance, their faces were beardless. They were also unwrinkled, unworn by time, and somehow immortal. This was how they had always been, created somehow, but not developed in stages from birth to the present age. There had been no process of coming of age for them, I thought later. No birth or death or all the things in between that trouble our own existence, or at least troubled us when we attended to them. There was only going through the motions, a pretense of life. In a way, they were a mirror of us, of what we wanted for ourselves. They marked time and nothing else. Time to do this, time to do that, time to make another town, time to relocate, having poisoned a new landscape with small country. During the standoff between the Smalls and my friend and me, an uncanny stillness prevailed. But then their heads swiveled simultaneously. each turned toward another. They didn't seem to be exchanging glances, though, or even looking directly into one another's glassy, empty eyes. Not as my friend and I looked to each other with the same thought in our minds. We couldn't run around them because they surrounded us, and we didn't want to jump down the steep incline at our backs and land in the small town. So we began to move slowly through their ranks, not knowing what to expect. While we had come there to harm them, our taste for that was now lost. It seemed to us, as we later talked of it, that we could not understand them at all, or what malevolence they might harbor towards us. Very slowly, then, we sidled our way among them, and they didn't attempt to block our path. However, they did do something, or seemed to do something. This was to lightly press their bodies against ours as we passed. That turned out to be worse than any brute physical encounter we could have had with them, their touch. For they were not stiff and rigid as we expected, not the hard plastic toys we might have neatly torn apart, bloodlessly dislodging their seemingly prosthetic limbs. Instead, we found that they were soft, very soft. Their shapes felt as if they were giving way as they lightly pressed themselves against us. But they were also swivel-headed dummy things, freakish unrealities like their town, and maybe everything having to do with small country. Did they even exist as our minds conjured existence, both our town and that of all else within our perception? What were these things that seemed to be all appearance and no substance? Fortunately, such questions did not paralyze us. Once my friend and I were on the other side of the smalls, we ran, without pause, to where we commenced our terribly misconceived incursion into small country. The rest of the night we spent shivering with cold and fear in the lavatory hut at the old park on the edge of town. The only time we spoke was in the morning, just before we parted for our respective homes. My friend looked at me with an abysmal expression on his face and said, "My dad'll kill me if he ever finds out what we did." "Yeah," I said, drawing out at length that single, stupid syllable, exhaling it in a dead voice. Not long after our misadventure, my friend moved away with his family. And before the end of that school year, those signs went up with the simple faces on them. They first appeared at the edge of town and then proceeded for some miles along the open road beyond. I made a point of going around and finding all the signs I could, noting which direction their arrows pointed to indicate small country. I saw that people still went to the old park. They must have been aware that small country wasn't far away, but that made no difference to them, not as it did to me. A few weeks before it was time for the new school year to begin, I received a letter from my friend. It was hand-delivered to me by my mother, who first took a moment to interrogate me about any packs of cigarettes I might have hidden in the basement, which was where I happened to be at the time, lying on an old sofa we had down there. After that night in small country, my friend and I tried smoking cigarettes for a while. I think we both wanted to do something we'd never done before, something to make us feel we had changed and were no longer those kids who talked so much about the smalls. I kept the last pack of cigarettes we shared, and my mom found them. I hadn't even smoked since my friend moved away. I was elated when I got his letter, which was only a single page, but I read that page countless times, savoring its words and even reciting them in my friend's voice. There was nothing more in the letter than my friend's banal description of the new place he was living and the school he would be attending. That was enough to relieve the sense of demoralization I felt since he had gone. I wrote back to him, of course, and that initiated an exchange of letters between us, and even some phone calls. I told him that I still had the last pack of cigarettes we shared, even though my mother had taken them. What I never asked him was whether he had made any new friends. In midwinter, I opened the latest missive from my friend after a hiatus during which she had answered none of my letters. What I read in it revived a kaleidoscope of memories and emotions, none of them welcome to my still delicate state of mind. The news my friend related was that his father had disappeared about a month before. One day, he didn't return from work, and his family had heard nothing from him since. My friend didn't write a word about any particular suspicions he had, and that I also nurtured. He did say that the police had come to his house, As a rule, his mother wouldn't have allowed them into their home to poke around. His father had never trusted the police or any other persons of officialdom, and neither did his mother. But in this circumstance, that rule went out the window. The police didn't find anything that interested them in the house, but when they looked around the garage, they turned up a lockbox hidden underneath the workshop table. My friend's mother gave them permission to open it, and inside they discovered, as my friend quoted them, stacks of literature. Then he wrote, "Both my mom and I were fairly certain that what they called literature wasn't pornography or anything of the kind. It was stuff about them." That was the first reference to the small people I could recollect appearing in our correspondences with each other. Naturally, this was a subject that we didn't want to linger over. My friend continued regarding what was hidden in his dad's lockbox that the police pried open. Some of it was in envelopes with postmarks from all over the world. The police rummaged through the material until my friend's mother told them there wasn't anything in there that would help them find her husband. "The cops didn't say a word after that," my friend wrote. "I thought they might. It seemed to me they should have, the way they were looking at each other. But they just piled the envelopes and stuff back in the box and shoved the box back underneath my dad's workshop table. Then they left, and we haven't heard from them since, the bastards." For a few days, I didn't know what to write in response to my friend's letter. I considered phoning him, but I didn't think it was a prudent action to take. Finally, I composed a short letter of vague condolences in hopes that his dad had business he thought it best not to share with him and his mother. My letter was a mass of circumlocutions that I was sure my friend would understand. To my grief, I never received a response to that letter, and it was almost spring before I could admit to myself that I would never hear from him again. I said that my friend avoided mentioning the Smalls in our letters. However, as I later pored over our correspondence, I saw that he had written something to me that I blocked from recall. The erasure of his words from my memory was understandable, for what he wrote was simply too strange to reflect upon for very long. "If you'll remember, Doctor, I posed the following question. How could we know we were keeping certain truths from ourselves regarding how things are in this world at its deepest level?" And the answer I gave to my own question was this: because we had done it before. Well, that's exactly what I had done when I read what my friend wrote to me in one of his letters. Here is my recitation of it from memory. "My dad got drunk last night and told me things I had never heard from him before. I didn't understand most of it. What I do remember was his repeating what he called a spectral link between the Smalls and some people in the real world. Then he went on about people who looked and acted like humans but were not human. Maybe he said they were not completely human. He did have a term for them. It was half-small people." You might be able to comprehend, Doctor, how disquieted I was to see written in my friend's hand certain words like that, at least in concept, had occurred to me only in a dream. I hated to think that there was a spectral link between myself and the Smalls, and though I have spoken of peculiar truths regarding how things really are in this world at its deepest level, truths that we keep ourselves from knowing, I concluded with stark lucidity that there was absolutely no spectral link between myself and the Smalls, not as I understood my friend's father to have used those words. If anything, it was exactly the opposite. The small people were drastically alien to me. I was derided by my parents as a shameful little bigot because of my fear of them and my hatred of them, feelings that I had not known to exist in anyone else besides my friend, and vicariously through him his father, and his mother, too, it seemed, who I believe had also gone the way of the rest of my friend's family. But where they had gone, I couldn't bring myself to ponder. While continuing to be afraid of the Smalls, and to hate them, I now transferred these emotions with a rabid vehemence toward the half-Smalls, who my friend added sometimes devolved, or whatever the proper term might be, in both appearance and nature into small people through and through. Following this transformation, which they might not even know was possible or consider desirable, there was nothing for them to do except move into small country and live among their kind. That is, if they didn't regard this prospect as so repellent that they took other measures, rather than lose the sense of who they were, or thought they were, or what they were, or thought they were. With its small people, this world just seemed a preposterous mess to me, and now it was revealed to be even worse than I knew. Why couldn't things be different? What would it take for our lives to make some kind of sense? Maybe that's just not possible, I thought. Maybe any world would be just as preposterous. Yet the existence of the half-smalls nevertheless still inspired in me a crawling fear, a new unseen horror, as I've mentioned having this sensation in dreams, along with a hatred of them for having what I thought was a weakness, connecting them in some spectral manner with the small people. At least the latter were something of a phenomenally known quantity to my mind, however little I understood about them. But the halfers were something else. Interlopers in a world where they didn't belong, the source of all questions about who or what human beings might be as a life form. For as tiresome as it had become, the question of what it means to be human continues to fervently preoccupy us, because without that definition we cannot positively know if our laborious self-perpetuation is worth the candle we keep lit in the blackness of the universe. We cannot decide whether we should continue or terminate the human race, if there is anything that might be called the human race, since we are as fragmented in the aggregate as we are as individuals, things of parts, and not the integrated organisms we represent to ourselves. All the same, as naive and arrogant as this may sound, I felt that my sensibility enabled my insight into this immemorial affair. I thought of this sensibility as a type of instinct that actually forced me to see things as they were, and not as I was supposed to see them, so that I could get by in life. From this point on, as I walked the streets of the town where I lived, I could see only how contrary everything was to the picture of it I was psychologically strong-armed into having. Now the place where I grew up was no more than another preposterous mess. The town's motto on the sign as you entered Main Street was, "A good place to live." Not exactly a boastful sentiment. In actuality, though, it was pretty crummy. Not crummy in itself, I should say, because I had never lived in any other towns. They might be as crummy as my native town. The whole planet might be crummy, for all I knew then. When I looked closely at the city hall, for instance, I could see it was wobbly. Maybe at one time I would have thought nothing of walking through the wide front doors of the place. Now that my eyes could see that they tilted quite visibly, I wouldn't have entered its space on a dare, or take the post office. If my mother had ordered me in her most calmly intimidating voice to go buy her some stamps, I wouldn't do it. Not 1 foot would I set inside, because its bricks were set together, all wrong. One of them could slide a little, I gauged, and the walls might come crashing down in a flash and bury me alive, as I was standing in line to buy some rotten stamps which had images on them that were so faded and cockeyed I couldn't tell any more what they were supposed to represent. Once they were printed with images of monuments in one place or another where my family went on vacation, as I remembered in my mind's eye, but from then on they appeared all bent up and sagging, and they were all supposed to be so grand. Taken in total, the whole world was supposed to be so grand, but it wasn't. Not from my perspective, which was no longer so muddled I couldn't see things for what they were, and not how I was supposed to see them. In my view, all the earth and anything that stood upon it was just like the town where I lived. Not a good place, but a crummy place. Even new places that people were always rushing around to build were crummy from the start, wobbly and tilted, bent and sagging. All the energy and hustling that went into building a car wash or a row of stores that seemed to shoot up overnight like mushrooms, it was just so useless. And the most piddling events were elevated as a matter of course beyond their significance, as testified by the ubiquitous grand openings, wherever you looked. It was all supposed to amount to something, whatever it was. Everything had to be imbued with consequence, but nothing amounted to anything. It was all just trying to be what it wasn't. Real, that is. Authentic in every sense of the word, and not fatally bogus. I could see the same thing in people that I did in the flimsy material world, this junkyard of cast-off ectoplasm. They didn't meet expectations either, though, as I said, no one yet has been able to say definitively who or what we are, and I don't think anyone will ever be able to do so. I don't think they want to. What I do think they want is to see that humans, real humans, are this and that and the other thing, that there are millions of qualities humans have that nothing else has, and that they say all this to keep us confused, to keep themselves confused about what humans really are, except that they're not small people. But now I was fixated on the half-smalls. Now my sensibility, my special instinct, had become sufficiently honed to discern who was what. Not that I expected any consolation from such knowledge. It was simply something to do. Well, I decided what to do with myself. At first, as I walked around town during the summer after I stopped receiving letters from my friend, I wasn't sure exactly how my sensibility was functioning. I would get a feeling, like a tingling inside me, when I saw certain people strolling down the sidewalk or sitting at picnic tables outside the frozen custard stand that did land office business through the summer months. I'm sure you get the picture, Doc. It was showtime and nothing but. No doubt some clickety-clack version of it was being enacted by the Smalls, as I was now with some confidence able to imagine after beholding one of their own towns in its construction stage. A poor excuse for even the crummiest human town, if one wants to get into degrees of crumminess, that is. All things considered, my wits were in relatively fair working order, and my sensibility was becoming more and more sharply attuned. Occasionally, the tingling sensation I felt in the proximity of certain persons caught me off guard and pierced my spine with anxiety, but for the most part I was in control. Within the span of about a week, I not only felt something about those people, but also began to see little things about them, things you wouldn't notice without an exacting gaze. After my confrontation with the small people and detecting the smoothness of their faces, which were bereft of the character bestowed by time, unwrinkled and unworn, I saw a family resemblance in the same people who set off that tingling inside me. I wished my friend could have been there, because I was sure he would have seen the same thing about them, that they were halfers. Some days I'd walk from one end of town to the other, and I'd pick out the real people from the half-small people. As I passed by each person, I would check off their identities in my mind. Halfer, real, and so on. Mr. So-and-so, halfer. The old woman who walks her dog in the park every day, real. School teachers, halfers, every one. Cops, too, all halfers. Which made me think that my friend's family and the investigating officers who found the literature under his father's workshop's table. The girl who sat next to me in math class, real. I was glad about that. The middle-aged lady in the window at the beauty shop, everyone thought she had a facelift done, but she was a halfer. With children, it was more of a challenge, sorting out the real ones from the halfers. Most of them I let pass as real. There was one group of kids, though, all spindly specimens, with empty stares. They had to be half-smalls. As all told, I judged about half the people in town as real and half as halfers. I had gotten to be quite proficient at spotting our citizens as one or the other. Too good, in the end. I really should have shut off my thoughts sometimes, but I couldn't do that. It was Saturday, and my dad was off work for the weekend. My family always barbecued hamburgers and hot dogs on those days and ate them together around a plastic table in the backyard. We don't tend to see our parents the way we do others. We're too close to them. Even if they make you miserable and call you a shameful little bigot, they're still your parents, special circumstances notwithstanding. But after all the time I spent around town separating the real people from the half-smalls, I scrutinized everyone the same. More to the point, I felt that tingling inside me. Being with both my mother and father for an extended period of time on a Saturday afternoon and sitting with them around a plastic table in the backyard, I was tingling like mad. My father was smiling slightly and staring with concentration as he always did. but I never noticed that he was really staring at nothing in particular, that he was more or less gawking with bottomless eyes. And though the sun was shining on my mother's smooth face, her big eyes weren't squinting. Furthermore, they didn't look right or left, up or down. They were just big eyes, like a big doll would have. The longer I sat with my parents eating hamburgers, hot dogs, and potato salad with no egg whites, because from the first time I ate potato salad with egg whites, I refused to eat it again that way, the more I tingled inside. My parents did what they had to do in order to be real parents to me. But we weren't biologically related, as I'm sure it says in your file on me. I was adopted as an infant, and now I knew that I was only a prop, something to aid them in not being found out for what they were. Before they told me, I already knew somehow that I was adopted, and I was never happy about that. But on that Saturday, as I sat eating dinner with my parents around a plastic table, I praised whatever there was to praise that I was adopted, or else I would have been a half or two, if in fact that's the way it works. Nevertheless, I was pleased not to be the real offspring. I couldn't be sure, of course, if reals give birth to halfers or the other way around, since I didn't know how the spectral link between the small people and the real people worked. My friend was taken from me before I could learn more about that, and maybe about other things. I hated that. I hated it with all my being. And what happened, as I mentioned, was that all my hate for the small people transferred to the half-smalls. Now I wondered if the reason for that transference wasn't due to my subliminal recognition of having parents who belonged to that weird species. Retrospectively, it made all the sense in this clockwork world that my father and mother were halfers. The way they reproached me so often about being a shameful little bigot, when in truth I was not a bigot, but a real person, who was afraid of the small people and couldn't accept the arrangement the big world had with them. Maybe real parents would have understood that, I don't know. I wanted to think so. I wanted to think that there was something sensible, or at least something of marginal value about the tick-tock world I had been born into. But the two halfers sitting with me at that plastic table only berated me as a shameful little bigot. Certainly because they wanted to stifle my sensitivity to how things were in the world at its deepest level, and to muddle my brain as I came of age, going through all the adjustments in the process so that I could be presented in company. That is, so that I would be a sightless moron like everyone else. Everyone except people like the only friend I ever had in my life. In a split second, as I sat munching my hamburger or hot dog and watching my mother and father that day, I was hopelessly possessed by hatred for them. That night, I lay awake in my bed for a long time, earnestly trying to arrive at some way to live with the household status quo, just as real humans had arranged at some time in the past to live with the small people, though no book I could find would pinpoint when that was or how it was done. But there was no way I could do that. No way at all. It must have been around the middle of the night. I didn't plan a specific time when I entered my mother and father's bedroom. They were lying on their backs in bed, the moonlight glowing on my father's slightly smiling face and concentrating stare, as well as on my mother's smooth face and big eyes, which were open. Both their eyes were open. I don't know why. Maybe they didn't sleep. It wasn't as if I was the sort of person to peek into his parents' bedroom to see what they were doing. "Dad, Mom," I said, just to get their attention. They didn't even sit up in bed, though. Maybe they were sleeping in their own way. "Listen," I continued. "I want to tell you something. What I want to tell you is..." Then, with all the lung power I could summon, I screamed, "I'm a shameful little bigot. I hate the small people. I hate them for all I'm worth. But more than I hate the small people, I hate you." Then, I jumped on the bed and was all over them with the knives I'd gotten from the kitchen. Push, push, push. Chop, chop, chop. They didn't make a sound the whole time. I can tell you one thing. Halfers aren't soft like the smalls. I really had to work on those things. They called themselves my parents. I wasn't exactly amazed that I never saw the inside of a courtroom, knowing as I did what I knew. I didn't know, however, what would ensue in the aftermath of my deed, that I would be locked up in this place. Whatever it isn't a prison, not with the superlative educational facilities you provided, allowing my mind and sensibility to flourish. If our positions were reversed, that would be my scheme. Cultivate me like a plant. Breed me into something that could express its view of the world at its deepest level. You were ready for me from the very first. So I have to assume I'm not the only one to do what I did, and for the reason I did it. That's right, isn't it, Doctor? But I've been here for so long. How many more doctors must I see who want to hear my story? Are you in training or something? I'm as sane as your shoes. We both know that. Even though I should have gone mad long ago from my dreams alone. Why can't I make a deal? Come to an arrangement. I'm practically an old man. My coming of age came and went. I'd kill myself if I thought you'd let me. That's not what you want, though, is it? Could you please give me an answer, just once? Everything is such a mystery with you people. Half as I used to think, but I don't know anymore. I lost my instinct for that the moment I stepped into this place. Did you do that? What about the tingling? That hasn't happened in who knows how long. It would be nice to see a clock or a calendar every so often. Don't you care about time? Whatever you are? How about space? Existence? All the commotion of reality? I've known it was all just a preposterous mess for ages now. I also learned that I should be on the outside, and the rest of this ludicrous world, or most of it, should be in here for study and rehabilitation, adjustment and readjustment, if that's the point. What are you trying to accomplish? Whatever it is, you seem to be doing a terrible job of it. Is everything still as crummy as I remember it? Your world, whichever one it may have been, was an offense to my eyes, and it didn't have to be that way. But maybe that's the way you wanted it. A nightmare, from morning stool to bedtime stories. Oh, here they come, the big boys. You can tell them to take their hands off me. Big boys, with big hands. But are they really big? Only half big. I believe an autopsy could establish the facts, if you'd allow me the pleasure. My parents were half smalls. The alignment of their bones was human enough, but their organs seemed all of a piece. It could have been they were starting to convert. I don't know. So what's inside of the small people, Doctor? My guess is that they're composed of some doughy substance inside and out. A flabby clay that can be molded into any form, having no identity of its own. Is this really our world? The real world? Or is it theirs? Did the right hand of evolution know what the left hand was doing? And what about the spectral link? I have my theories. I would lots of time to think about that for what it's worth. Thinking. Give me a hint. Something to mull over. I just need a speck of hope to keep me from going to pieces. A little truth to hang on to. Answer me, Doctor, before I'm dragged off. Who are you? What are you? Listen to me. For the love of all that is real. Who am I? What am I?